So welcome to this session on privacy threat modeling. I'm really excited to kick us off with this talk on the privacy threat taxonomy that we've been developing. So let's start off with the privacy risk equation because it's a great lens through which we can conceptualize privacy threat modeling. Privacy risks are a function of privacy threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences, where privacy vulnerabilities are flaws in a system that can be exploited to cause privacy harms or consequences. Privacy threats are actions or inactions that exploit privacy vulnerabilities, and privacy consequences are the harms to individuals that come from the exploitation of privacy vulnerabilities. And when you want to model and manage your privacy risk, there are a number of privacy risk models to choose from. There are also models for privacy consequences and for privacy vulnerabilities, many of them from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, but many of them also academic, Solve's taxonomy, Kalo's objective, subjective harms. But when it comes to privacy threats, there's only one model actually advertised as a privacy threat model. The Linden model was presented at PEPR last year, actually. We would argue, actually, that Linden is a crossover model between a vulnerability model and a threat model because it focuses on system flaws rather than the exploitation of those flaws. I know that's a very fine distinction between the two. And Linden is also a very high-level model. So the motivation for this work is this gap in privacy risk modeling around privacy threat modeling. We thought that there was an opportunity for a more data-driven, a more granular model that can be used to describe privacy attacks, the actual steps that a threat actor goes through to carry out something that causes a privacy harm. So what is a privacy attack, though? That's not a term that's often used. So we define a privacy attack as actions or inactions that cause a perceived privacy harm, as defined by Solve's taxonomy, that do not solely involve cybersecurity violations. And let's dive deeper into two of the components of this definition, Solve's taxonomy and the cybersecurity violations. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Solve's taxonomy. It's an ontology for privacy harms that was developed in the mid-aughts. It's held up to scrutiny. It's used in many different research contexts. And it divides privacy harms into 4 different categories: information collection harms, information processing harms, information dissemination harms, and invasions or invasive harms. And what we say in our definition is that most actions or inactions that cause a privacy harm are actually privacy attacks, except those that arise exclusively from cybersecurity violations. So we're defining our scope as the yellow bubble, not intersected by the blue bubble. So there are fantastic granular cybersecurity threat models that cover the entire blue bubble, which can be called cybersecurity-related privacy events or confidentiality attacks involving personal information. One example is the MITRE attack framework, which is a cybersecurity model that our privacy threat taxonomy is actually based on. And we don't want to duplicate these cybersecurity efforts or focus solely on data breaches, because when you start talking about data breaches as privacy attacks, it just eats your whole threat model. So our focus is on privacy attacks that do not arise from cybersecurity violations, but the question can be like, what actually exists in that yellow scope bubble? We're going to ground ourselves with 3 examples. So the first example of a privacy attack we'll discuss involves re-identification of health data, which is very apt after the DP talks that we just heard. So the state of Washington maintained a database of patient-level health data containing almost all hospitalizations. The dataset didn't include names or addresses, but it included full demographics and zip codes. So a researcher purchased the dataset for $50 and re-identified it with a 43% success rate. So this attack clearly demonstrates the Solve's harm identification, which represents harms from reduced anonymity. So the next example we'll talk about is Lenovo Superfish, and you might say, oh, that was a cybersecurity attack. Wait a second. In this attack, Lenovo pre-installed software onto its laptops that man-in-the-middle packets being sent in and out of the computer. So the software intercepted all the information coming in and out over the internet, it decrypted the packets with its key, and it read them so that it could target ads at the user with invasive pop-ups. So the 2 harms from Solve's taxonomy demonstrated by this are insecurity and intrusion, where insecurity because the attack caused the user's web traffic to be significantly less secure, and intrusion because the pop-ups intruded onto the traditionally private domain of your experience on your device. So the third and final example we'll talk about today is Cambridge Analytica, a privacy attack not only on individuals, but on our democracy in the United States. And it demonstrates the power of non-cybersecurity attacks, of privacy attacks. So in Cambridge Analytica, data was appropriated, a solve harm, from a personality quiz and used to target political ads, which amount to decisional interference because they invade on the political choices that citizens are making. Such data were also used during the election to cause chilling effects and cause people to actually not vote in the election, which is another form of decisional interference, where decisional interference is an invasive harm and appropriation is an information dissemination harm. So we use solve taxonomy to classify these individual privacy attacks based on their privacy consequences or harms because they don't arise solely from cybersecurity violations, so they fit our definition. So they cause solve harms, they're not just cybersecurity, therefore they fit our definition of a privacy attack. But Solve's taxonomy is inherently a privacy consequence model. What we want to do is describe the components of the attack so that we can better understand the privacy threats themselves. We're building a privacy threat model. We want to improve privacy risk management by making it threat informed, targeting mitigation efforts at the most consequential or likely threats. Now, unfortunately, across most of the industry right now, privacy risk management is still the exception, not the rule. This room obviously excluded, whereas compliance-oriented privacy programs are pretty standard. So the focus is on compliance with rules and regulations or with policies, not on managing the risks to individuals. So privacy can also take a cybersecurity perspective and focus on data breaches, which we discussed, which misses the potential threats like the 3 that we just covered, which are not data breaches. So we hope that by developing a threat model that is granular and can be used to describe privacy attacks, that we can actually change the narrative around privacy threats. The privacy community is still without a descriptive threat model or even a kill chain model. Cybersecurity's had the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain for ages now. We have the FIPS and privacy impact assessments. We don't have a granular threat model, which takes me to our work on the Privacy Threat Taxonomy. We're going to transition now to talking about this threat model that we are in the process of developing. Just know that you guys are seeing prototype today. You are not seeing a final product. So what we did was we started with a data set of known privacy attacks that occurred in the wild. We followed a methodology from Garfinkel and Theophanos' paper, 44 non-breach privacy events, which down-selected from closed FTC and FCC cases to those that fulfilled their definition of a non-breach privacy event, which is what our definition of a privacy attack is actually based on. I want to note that neither definition requires malicious intent or any action whatsoever. Benign intent and inaction can be a privacy attack if it causes a privacy harm. So we looked at all the FTC and FCC cases between 2000 and 2022, and we found that 146 involved privacy attacks based on our definition. Now, we cataloged these attacks with metadata, such as how many individuals were harmed and what data were involved. And we used them to generate 2 prototypes. So the Privacy Threat Taxonomy is a privacy threat model. It is a hierarchical ontology that describes the components of a privacy attack. The privacy threat clusters are groups of attacks from our data set that share similar attack components. It is a typology of privacy attacks. And each privacy threat cluster will have an associated privacy threat pattern. So now we've got a taxonomy, clusters, and patterns. The privacy threat patterns are generic kill chains that describe the type of attacks within a cluster. So the patterns are developed by taking a privacy threat cluster, mapping it to the privacy threat taxonomy, and then taking the results of that mapping and assembling it into a linear or semi-linear kill chain. So basically, clusters can be mapped to the taxonomy, and that mapping creates a privacy threat pattern, which are similar to design patterns. All of this is going to make more sense in a moment when we go through an example. I just wanted you to understand the interoperability of the 2 prototypes and how they relate to the privacy threat patterns. So, structuring was our first research effort to develop the privacy threat taxonomy. So what we did first is we broke the attacks into individual threat actions taken by the potential threat actor or the potentially threatening system. Next, we grouped the threat actions into domains of similar activities. So that looks like this. An activity is a group of threat actions, and here we see the collection activity and the exposure threat action, which is under the sharing activity. It's a hierarchy. So next we began refining the threat actions and activities so that there would be few overlaps and gaps between them in the model. So this involved taking individual attacks from our data set and mapping them to the taxonomy, identifying where the taxonomy could not and could capture the nuances of the attack. This is a process we're still engaged in. It's quite difficult. The taxonomy doesn't yet fit all attacks easily. And identifying how to resolve gaps and overlaps and what things actually belong in the model. For example, does data bias belong in a privacy model? We're also facing the challenge of how to clearly and concisely name the threat actions, which is no small feat on its own. So we will continue this process of mapping individual attacks to the taxonomy until it stabilizes. And few to no changes occur when we map each new attack iteratively against the taxonomy. So there are 13 activities currently in the Privacy Threat Taxonomy. I am going to read them. I know they're small. These are the different activities that a system or an organization can take in relation to personal information and data subjects. So from left to right, we've got notice and consent, collection of information, insecurity specifically related to privacy, identification of data, quality assurance, not only of data, but also of data sources, of different parts of your lifecycle model, aggregation and processing, manageability of data by the data subject, sharing, use against the data subject, and retention and destruction, and deviations, for example, deviations from stated policy. So here are some examples of threat actions from the collection activity. These describe different potentially threatening actions that an entity can take in relation to data collection. So for example, data collection can occur via tracking or by externally appropriating data collected for another purpose, or intercepting it, like in the Lenovo Superfish attack. So our second research effort involved the clusters and clustering the attacks in our data set into a typology. So similar to the taxonomy, the first step is to break attacks into the threat actions. But next, instead of categorizing them in a hierarchical model, we took attacks with similar threat actions and grouped them into threat clusters. To verify the clusters, sorry, I woke up with a frog. We mapped the entire data set to our cluster types, refining and renaming our clusters along the way, merging them, separating them, killing some of them. And so a single attack may map to multiple clusters based on its components and its complexity. So once we actually stabilize the taxonomy, which is not yet, we will be able to map each of the clusters onto the taxonomy, identifying which activities and threat actions define its generic kill chain. This is going to be, we already know, a finicky and tricky process. It's not going to be easily clear which threat actions and activities are necessary or optional, because there can be many different types of attacks even within a cluster. So what we need to do is we will find exemplary attacks within the cluster, and we'll select activities and threat actions that represent these exemplary attacks, trying as best as we can to have the threat pattern represent as many attacks and as many exemplary attacks within a cluster as possible. So after this mapping, we're going to assemble all of these mappings into threat patterns, the generic kill chains, and this will make more sense. We're going to go through an example. So the example we're going to use is data de-identification. Whoever put us after the DP group is pretty good. So here's what it looks like mapped onto the taxonomy. So sometimes an activity is selected, and sometimes a threat action within the activity is selected. So when an activity is selected, it means that it's essential to the pattern or the kill chain of the attack, but that any threat action within the activity will do. So for example, in this threat pattern, there needs to be some form of generation of a data set, some form of maybe data collection. But how the data are collected is not important to the pattern. What's essential for this pattern is that the data are not de-identified properly. So here's what the taxonomy activities and threat actions look like as a threat pattern. So the collection, identification, and sharing activities do not have individual threat actions specified, so they appear without any of the gray tile threat actions, while the quality assurance and processing activities appear with their relevant threat actions, data not de-identified and insufficient de-identification. So these threat actions are what differentiate this pattern from other patterns. Aggregation is a common feature in this pattern, but it's not actually essential to the kill chain. The de-identification pattern can actually exist without aggregation. For example, one of the attacks in our data set involves a local news station which published a woman's full name and her phone number and the rest of her contact details on the local news. So here is a chance where, where lack of de-identification existed without aggregation, actually. So it was just a single record that was not properly de-identified. So you can also map individual attacks from the data set onto both prototypes. So here are the 3 threat clusters or threat patterns associated with the Lenovo Superfish attack: preemption of privacy settings, insecurity, and behavioral advertising. And each of these will eventually have a privacy threat pattern once we're done with the taxonomy. So here's what Lenovo Superfish looks like mapped onto the taxonomy itself. So to give you a better understanding of the threat actions and how an attack can be described with the taxonomy, we're going to go through this whole attack mapping. So you can see here that Lenovo provided neither notice nor consent, any consent mechanism for users to understand and agree with the monitoring and the pop-ups. The collection occurred via intercepting information. Lenovo caused privacy-related insecurity through insufficient encryption and digital certificates and undermining authentication. They identified the users using persistent identifiers. There was no way for users to manage their own data or settings because the controls completely bypassed the user. Personally identifiable information was aggregated with web browsing history, which is sensitive information. And finally, the data collected were used to actually intrude on the user's web experience via invasive pop-ups. So we hope that the categorization and the naming of different threat actions and activities allows for a better understanding of privacy threats. And we hope that it facilitates discussion about privacy attacks. That's the goal. So we want to create both a method for talking about privacy and a way to model privacy threats. We've seen that similar models for cybersecurity threats have done both, and we see the dramatic benefits in cybersecurity from each. They're already on to threat-informed cybersecurity defense. We want to get to threat-informed privacy defense. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about how the privacy threat taxonomy and clusters can be used and our next steps. So to use the taxonomy for threat modeling, you can do one of 2 things. You can assemble a data set of attacks associated with similar technologies and map those onto the taxonomy. Or you can map the system itself to the taxonomy, asking, could this action be a threat action or an action? For example, are you de-identifying information? Are you vetting your information source? These could be threat actions. Once you've mapped to the taxonomy, you identify which threat patterns might be relevant to the system, and you disrupt those patterns with privacy mitigations. Now, we plan on developing a web app tool that will help with these final steps. So all a user will have to do is select the individual threat actions on the taxonomy, and it will pre-populate with the associated clusters, and each cluster will have associated mitigations. So we're going to populate the web app with all of the different privacy patterns and what they look like on the taxonomy and how the taxonomy might get you to the threat patterns, as well as, of course, a whole wiki of all of the definitions of everything in the taxonomy. So you just select your threat actions, the tool tells you which pattern your system might be causing, and you can disrupt those patterns with mitigations that lower the privacy threat. You could think of this as a privacy threat assessment. And as an added bonus, you'll have a better understanding of privacy threats and ways of discussing threats with management and others using the taxonomy and clusters terminology. So like other threat models, we do hope that the privacy threat taxonomy will integrate with privacy risk models and risk management. And so by analyzing systems and asking, could this action or an action be a threat to the data subject, system owners and operators will better understand how vulnerabilities and flaws can be exploited. Privacy threat assessments can become part of privacy risk management. Then system owners and operators can tailor their mitigation efforts to the vulnerabilities and flaws in their system that are most likely to be exploited, those with the highest threat risk. and they can do this in a data-driven way. So like in cybersecurity, we expect that threat-informed privacy defense will be the next phase of privacy risk management. So what's up? We're going to finish the first iteration of the taxonomy and the threat pattern generation. We're generating a new data set, not FTC and FCC cases, but out of news publications. We are going to map that new data set to our prototypes, and we are going to adjust and stabilize them with this new data set of not just things that actually violate the law in the United States, but things that cause privacy harm outside of things that violate the law. So we're looking for people to get involved. We're looking for data sets or information about privacy attacks. We're looking for partners to beta test, and we are looking for experts to give feedback on the taxonomy and the clusters. And we're inviting everyone to join us at the Privacy Threat Modeling Workshop at SUPS this August in Boston. So please go to our workshop website and register for SUPS and register for our workshop, where we will be diving really deep into this work and into Linden, the other privacy threat model, as well as hearing some really interesting papers presented. So thank you guys all very much.